My name is Peter Boyle. I'm the president of Valour Canada, and welcome to the 104th anniversary of the Battle of Vimy Ridge talk that's co-hosted by the Royal Alberta United Services Institute and Valour Canada. I'm just going to do a little bit of a preamble and a little talk as we allow the last few people to enter the meeting, and we'll kick off with the talk tonight. So I do look forward to a time where we'll be able to do these in person. However, for now, I hope you enjoy this format. We have three great speakers lined up to talk in a few minutes, and I'll tell you about them shortly. Before we start, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Valour Canada, and then I'll be introducing Major General Paul Burry to talk a bit about the Royal Alberta United Services Institute. Many of you will know who Valour Canada is. However, for those who don't, let me tell you about it. So our goal is to educate Canadians with a focus on youth about Canada's military history and heritage. We're a not-for-profit charity, and we believe that it's important for future generations to know about those who went before us and for the Canadian values around the world. We do this in a number of ways. Probably the one we do the most is an in-museum character-based program that runs in military museums and schools across the country. It's obviously on hold a little right now due to COVID. However, the education team is keen to get this going again in the fall. We also produce a series of documentary videos, which you can watch on our website or our YouTube channel. These are accompanied with lesson plans that allows teachers to use in their classrooms. And I encourage you to view our latest set, which is the Valour Canada War Series with military historian Andy Robertshaw. One of our more exciting programs is we're now doing virtual tours. So these are virtual tours of historic sites and places. You can tour a Second World War fighting ship, the HMCS Haida, a Lancaster bomber, battlefields in France or Holland, and we were excited to release our latest one, which is a virtual tour of the King's Own Calgary Regiment's gallery at the military museums here in Calgary just last week. We have a few exciting projects coming up this year, and in particular, a project working with the Navy, Army, and Air Cadets, as well as the Junior Canadian Rangers. So I encourage you to visit our website, sign up for our newsletter, and learn about the exciting programs that we offer. I'd now like to introduce Major General retired Paul Burry from the Royal Alberta United Services Institute, and he's going to say a few words of welcome from RAUSI. General Burry.
Yeah, thanks very much, Peter. Good evening, everybody. It's with great pleasure that the Royal Alberta United Services Institute co-hosts tonight's presentations. Events such as this are part of the Institute's mandate, which is to encourage and promote the arts, sciences, and literature related to Canada's defense and security community. Now, the Institute began as the Alberta Military Institute in May 1920, and I believe that a number of the members during those initial years would have been heavily engaged during the battle that we're discussing tonight. It has been said that Canada came of age as a country during those brutal and violent days in April 1917. Those Canadians accomplished so much. The planning and preparations for the battle were extensive and brought together for the first time the 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps to fight as one formation. The battle helped to create a new and stronger sense of national identity and in our country, and it propelled Canada's military into an independent armed force. We also learned a number of really valuable lessons, which continue to be reinforced with Canadian forces at present. Things like extensive preparation of the battlefield, timely rehearsals, working in an all-arms environment, and ensuring coordination with our allies, and that's just to name a few. The Royal Alberta United Services Institute works to ensure the lessons learned from historic battles such as Vimy Ridge continue to be studied and made available to audiences all around the world. And we look forward to hearing tonight's speakers and of the hard-won lessons from the battle which will be discussed. I think we're all anxious to listen to this or get into the speakers tonight. So Peter, I'll sum up there and turn it over back to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, General Burry. Okay, so we're off to the main event. Tomorrow is the 104th anniversary of the historic attack by the Canadian Corps on Vimy Ridge. This evening, we'd like to look a bit deeper into the events of that day. Most Canadians will know the battle, however, perhaps not the larger context of the war at that stage. And we all know a commonly heard narrative, which I'm going to paraphrase from one of our speakers. I'll let you guess who. But you do hear endlessly that the French and the British tried to take Vimy and failed. And voila, an army of lumberjacks shedding the yoke of colonialism did it in one day. What we hope to explain to you tonight is the broader context of the war at that stage, what the Canadians did achieve, and also how we remember this as a nation afterwards. So we've got three great speakers to talk about that. Our first speaker is going to cover the broader context of the war in 1917 and the strategic overview that brought us to the attacks in April of 1917. The British would know this as the Battle of Arras, and over 500,000 men would attack around that French town. Just 10 kilometers north of Arras was Vimy Ridge, and our second speaker will look into the details of this great victory. And again, our final speaker will look at the significance of Vimy and how we remember the battle. When the speakers have concluded, we'll move into a question and answer with Dr. Brennan and Dr. Bird. Unfortunately, Dr. Jones will not be with us this evening in person. As you will see, you're all muted, and this will remain throughout the presentation. If you do have questions, I would ask that you put them in the chat, and I will collect these and I will ask them at the end. Alternatively, you can send an email to contact@valourcanada.ca, and we'll keep an eye on that email, but we would prefer that you use the chat. Similarly, if you have any technical difficulties, I would encourage you to send an email to that contact@valourcanada.ca email address, and we'll do our best to help you. At the end of the questions that we have from the chat, we will have the opportunity for people to raise their hand and ask a person or make directly to Dr. Brennan and Dr. Bird, but the chat will allow us to consolidate those questions a little bit better. So first off, we will hear a pre-recorded video from Dr. Spencer Jones from the University of Wolverhampton in the UK. Spencer is a senior lecturer in Armed Forces and War Studies at the University of Wolverhampton, and he's the regimental historian for the Royal Regiment of Artillery. He's also the president of the Guild of Battlefield Tour Guides, and he has spent a lot of time on the Western Front, and I've been lucky enough to spend some time with him visiting the battlefields. So we'll now listen to Dr. Brennan. Just give me a moment to get this going. And
hello, my name is Dr. Spencer Jones. I'm a senior lecturer in Armed Forces and War Studies at the University of Wolverhampton in the UK, and I'm also the official historian of the Royal Regiment of Artillery. It gives me great pleasure to address the Valour Canada event today, and I only wish I could be with you live, but unfortunately, due to the time difference, I will be addressing you at around about 2 a.m. UK time, and I can assure you I would not be at my best at that hour. So instead, I'm presenting this pre-recorded lecture for you. And in this pre-recorded lecture, I want to explore Allied strategy in 1917 and the build-up to the Battle of Arras and trade.
I'm just going to pause there for a moment because I'm having some issues. Is everybody able to see and hear that talk that's going on right now? Maybe one of Toki or Jordan could address.
We can see and hear it.
Yes,
okay,
we are, Peter.
Apologies. All right, sorry about that. I had another screen going where I was trying to do some double checking. It wasn't working there, so I will just let it carry on.
That would ultimately lead British and, of course, Imperial, including Canadian forces, to the Battle of Arras in April 1917. Because the story of how the forces arrived here and what purpose they're attempting to achieve is an interesting one in itself. And to understand it, we have to actually step right back into 1916. The events that would lead up to Britain's commitment to fight the Battle of Arras would ultimately shake British civil-military relations to the very core and would leave lasting damage that would dog British efforts throughout 1917 and indeed into early 1918. This is a complex and an important story, and it's one that I think will provide some very interesting background for you in the lead up to understanding the events of the Battle of Vimy Ridge itself. Let's step back then, a moment in time, and consider the events that led to actually 1917. And to do this, we need to step back into 1916 itself. It's a year that I've described elsewhere in writing as the end of the beginning. And in this, I'm echoing, of course, Winston Churchill's description of the Battle of El Alamein, which he memorably described as not the beginning of the end, but instead the end of the beginning. 1916 had, for the Allies, been defined by the so-called general offensive concept, a concept that had been created in late 1915, where it was agreed that the Allied powers, Britain, France, Italy, and Russia, would launch simultaneous, or at least near simultaneous, as in within 2 weeks of one another, offensives against the Central Powers on each of the Allied powers' respective fronts. The idea behind the general offensive was that by launching this coordinated series of blows, it would prevent the Allies being defeated in piecemeal, and it would instead overwhelm Germany and Austro-Hungary's ability to respond to all these threats simultaneously. The general offensive concept had much to recommend it. It would allow the Allies to combine their efforts to attack Germany and Austro-Hungary on three separate fronts: the Western, the Italian, and of course the Eastern Front, and perhaps take advantage of the Allies' superior manpower. Of course, it did not play out quite as the Allies expected. The Germans' opening of an offensive at Verdun in February 1916 upset the timetable for the general offensive, but nevertheless, it would go ahead largely as planned, with Britain launching the Somme offensive in July 1916, Russia launching the Brusilov offensive in June 1916, and the Italians launching the Battle of the Isonzo in May 1916. This series of offensives would rock the Central Powers, not to mention the slow but sure French recovery of the initiative at the Battle of Verdun, ultimately stopping the German offensive and inflicting horrendous attrition on the German attackers. Struck from multiple angles, both Austro-Hungary and Germany at times reeled under this offensive. The Brusilov offensive almost destroyed the Austro-Hungarian army in the east, and it was only the rapid transfer of German reinforcements that stopped it turning into a total debacle. The Verdun offensive, originally designed to bleed the French army to death, instead almost did the same for the Germans, as their offensive became bogged down in brutal attritional fighting that ultimately failed to claim the French forts in the Verdun sector and results in terrible attrition for the German army. And the Somme offensive, which I imagine needs little introduction to the present audience. Although often defined by its first day, we should really define it instead by the months that followed, and September 1916 was the worst month of the battle for German forces, with their reserves reduced to a parlous state and the once thought impregnable fortress of Thiepval finally falling into Allied hands. And although the Somme also took a very heavy toll on British and French lives, it nevertheless inflicted significant damage on the German army. And taken as a whole, these three great offensives, plus the Battle of the Isonzo, which was an exclusively Italian and Austro-Hungarian affair, these three battles tore the initiative from the hands of the Central Powers, inflicted significant damage on Germany and Austro-Hungary, and rocked the German government to its very core. And added to this, a battle not part of the general offensive concept, but decisive in its own way, the great naval engagement, the Battle of Jutland, fought at the end of May and the start of June 1916, in which the Germans might claim some tactical success, inflicting more casualties on the Royal Navy, but suffered a significant, perhaps even decisive strategic defeat. Their fleet sent fleeing for its life by the end of the battle, never again to seriously seek an engagement with the Royal Navy in the North Sea, and therefore effectively surrendering the initiative at sea to the Royal Navy, allowing the blockade, the economic blockade of Germany, to grow ever tighter. This, therefore, was a significant year for the conduct of the First World War, and hence the end of the beginning. Germany would be rocked on its heels. The Central Powers would be in a dire strategic position at the end of 1916. And for the first time, there's some indication that German home front morale wobbled, as indicated by the buying of bonds, usually seen as an indication of confidence, particularly the middle class, that a nation will win the war. The purchase rate of bonds in Germany in 1916 declined precipitously, a clear indication of the damage that this year of battles had had upon Germany. And hence, I think it's appropriate to describe this as the end of the beginning. The first phase of the First World War ended with 1916, and the second phase in 1917 and 18 was about to begin and will be equally as hard fought. The effects in Germany were swift. Erich von Falkenhayn, who had taken over in 1914 from Helmuth von Moltke the Younger and had commanded the German forces in the West throughout that period, was replaced. He was replaced in August 1916, blamed for the bloodbath at Verdun, blamed for the fiasco on the Eastern Front and the Brusilov offensive, and clearly struggling to contain the Somme offensive. He was replaced by these two men who would become known later as the silent dictatorship, as they assumed ever greater powers over Germany itself. Paul von Hindenburg, who would be overall chief of the German military, and his subordinate Erich Ludendorff, who would command the German forces in the West. Ludendorff and Hindenburg were horrified by the damage the German army was receiving on the Western Front and shocked by the clear material superiority that the Allies, especially the British, were demonstrating in battle at the Somme. It was clear that the balance of power in the West had shifted quite dramatically, and whereas in 1915, Germany had, with relative ease, held off particularly British offensives, in 1916, this was no longer the case. It was clear that the British, and by this, of course, I mean the British Imperial Army, had come of age and had now become a very significant military threat. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, very soon after assuming command in August 1916, began plans for a new defensive line in the West. This would, of course, bear the name of its architect in some ways, of Paul von Hindenburg, the Hindenburg Line, a new series of defenses, construction of which began in September 1916, that would be positioned some miles behind the Somme front and would form an anchor for the German line. Rather than allowing the Germans to be crushed at the Somme, this new defensive line, which would be constructed throughout the winter of 1916 and 1917, would provide a new fallback position, allowing the Germans to shorten their line, move to a much more defensible position, and crucially free up reserves to resist any future Allied general offensives. The Hindenburg Line will play a significant part in the build-up to the Battle of Arras. But the focus of this talk is going to be on the Allied strategy that led to this route. While Hindenburg and Ludendorff were planning how to reorganize the German line as a result of the tremendous blows that had been struck against it in 1916, the Allies too were also seeking new leadership. Falkenhayn had been replaced because it was felt he'd failed in 1916 and his strategic vision at Verdun had been flawed. But although the Allies could claim to have had the better of the fighting in 1916, this did not seem apparent to political leadership in Great Britain. And whilst the Germans were constructing the Hindenburg Line in France, a political battle was breaking out in Britain between two former colleagues, Herbert Asquith on the left and David Lloyd George on the right. Herbert Asquith had been Prime Minister first of the Liberal government that had taken Britain to war in 1914 and had later been Prime Minister of a Liberal Conservative coalition that had been running the country since 1915. But the Battle of the Somme had done great damage to this coalition, particularly to Asquith politically. Asquith's preferred method of ruling both his party and indeed running the war had been a hands-off approach, allowing the military more or less a free hand in how to conduct the war, while he focused on the civilian side of the question. But this approach had been seen as unsatisfactory by a number of members within the government and indeed outside the government, who felt that Asquith's hands-off policy had allowed the military to take Britain's forces into an attritional, appalling struggle at the Somme, which brought no prospect of victory, no decisive breakthroughs, and indeed no victories that could be readily celebrated in the UK. And that the cost of this battle and the promise, which was apparent in late 1916, that the coming year would feature more of this type of fighting, was too much for some figures outside the government to bear. Notable amongst them, David Lloyd George, previously Asquith's Chancellor of the Exchequer, and in 1916 the Minister of Munitions. Lloyd George was furious with Asquith and believed that Asquith's hands-off approach amounted to nothing more than what Lloyd George described as a government of inaction, and that what was needed was new blood in the government, somebody who was going to take charge of military affairs, who was going to actually bring some strategic vision to Britain's war, rather than simply allowing the army to go on, in Lloyd George's words, hammering away at the Germans without result. Lloyd George called instead for knockout blows to be delivered against Germany, or perhaps even Germany's allies, to try and reduce the strength of Imperial Germany and the Central Powers, allowing a decisive victory to be won. What Lloyd George did not want was another Battle of the Somme, and he felt that it was only by taking charge of government that he would be able to dictate British strategy. This led to what effectively amounted to a coup in British politics in late 1916, as Lloyd George secretly assembled allies, outmaneuvered Asquith, and ultimately evicted him from the position of Prime Minister, an action that would sour these two men who once had a great friendship. It would sour that friendship for the rest of their life. And although they would eventually forgive each other very late in the day, late in Asquith's life, there's some question whether how sincere that forgiveness was. Lloyd George became Prime Minister of Great Britain in late 1916, and he was determined to bring a new vision to how the war was going to be fought. Whereas Asquith had promoted a hands-off approach and allowed the military to dictate strategy. Lloyd George found himself wanting to play a much more active role in shaping how the war was conducted. His weakness was that he was a layman in military terms. He had no experience whatsoever in the military. He'd not even dabbled in being a soldier in his younger days, and like some of his colleagues, and indeed some of his friends, notably Winston Churchill. So Lloyd George was hampered in some ways by being very conscious of his amateur status, and yet at the same time he came with a clear vision and the determination to potentially see it through. There would be no more simply standing back and allowing the generals to batter away on the Western Front. Instead, the war was going to be fought in a much more intense, much more sophisticated, and ultimately, Lloyd George hoped, a much more productive way for Great Britain than it had been in 1916. Essentially, he had three key ideas which he wanted to promote at this time. The first was that he wanted to redouble Allied efforts. In late 1916, a German peace proposal, not really seriously intended to open negotiations, more intended to sow division amongst the Allies, but nevertheless, a German peace proposal all the same had been issued. This had actually caused some debate, particularly in Britain and at the fringes of the British government. Lloyd George would have no truck with a compromise peace with Germany. His call for a knockout blow was his rebuttal of these German approaches. He wanted to see Germany and German militarism crushed for good. Britain had made too much of a commitment to this war by this stage to settle for anything other than a significant victory. And one of the reasons that Lloyd George made his move in late 1916 to overthrow Asquith's government was a fear that the relatively, in Lloyd George's view at least, relatively weak government of Asquith might be tempted into opening negotiations with Germany and seeking some sort of compromise. Lloyd George thought this would be a fatal mistake, and he was determined there would be no sort of compromise under his watch whatsoever. And to ensure there would be no compromise, Allied efforts had to be redoubled. Production had to be increased. There had to be better commitment of resources. There had to be a wholesale reorganization of the British war effort, which included a tighter approach towards conscription, improved munitions production, a reform of shipping to ensure that the bottlenecks that had been apparent in the British shipping trade were eliminated, and more besides. So this was going to be the war fought at a much more intense pitch, and this is a period sometimes known as remobilization. And yet, whilst Lloyd George was looking to improve the strength of the British military commitment, to improve its production, its manpower, and indeed everything else besides, one thing he was keen to avoid was another bitter attritional Somme offensive on the Western Front. He had no interest in this approach whatsoever. And indeed, when the Allied military leaders in late 1916 made an agreement in a mood of what was described later as sober optimism, that the general offensive would be relaunched in 1917, Lloyd George was less than impressed. To him, the general offensive of 1916, whatever military strategic effect it may have had come at an intolerable cost to British and, by extension, Empire society. Casualties were simply unsustainable. The strain it was placing on the home front was unsustainable, and ultimately, asking the British and Imperial public to endure another year such as this threatened to crack home front morale, which had been very strong up to this point. But in early 1917, there were growing signs, not of demoralization, but certainly of war weariness amongst the British and indeed Imperial populace. And Lloyd George thought another great Somme offensive, fought seemingly endlessly with no great strategic objective in sight, might just crack British home front morale, and he was certainly not prepared to have that happen. And so he rejected the idea of another great attritional offensive on the Western Front. His one great strategic idea in early 1917 was what we might term the Italian option. Lloyd George hoped that a massive transfer of British and indeed French artillery to the Italian front would allow the Italian army to crack open the Austro-Hungarian line that was defending the Alps. And in this, Lloyd George saw a way to potentially win a decisive and a far-reaching victory against one of Germany's allies at a relatively low cost in British and Imperial lives. The Italian army would do the bulk of the fighting, and the British army would mainly provide materiel and expertise rather than flesh and blood and manpower to actually spearhead that assault. Lloyd George's Italian option had something to recommend it. Austro-Hungary was reeling, particularly from the effects of the Brusilov offensive, which may well have cost the Austro-Hungarian army 1 million men in 1916. And it was felt that the main barrier to Italian success on this front was a lack of modern and heavy artillery. And perhaps if the British and the French could provide those guns, Lloyd George spoke of 500 heavy pieces, it would be enough to batter their way through the Alps and perhaps knock out Austro-Hungary, which was known to be tottering at this stage of the war. The problem with the Italian option for Lloyd George was the Italians themselves were not entirely sold on it, and the commanders of both the British and the French army largely rejected it entirely, and it was difficult for him to sell this option. Nevertheless, he didn't completely abandon it. He'd revisit it throughout 1917. But in early 1917, it was clear it was not a goer. What else could he do? Well, in this, circumstances favoured him, because whilst Britain was changing its bowlers, so to speak, politically, in France, similar changes were underway, both political upheaval and also military upheaval. Although 1916 was painted by French propaganda as a great victory, Verdun had been held, and the Somme was also seen as a victory of liberating French territory. Nevertheless, it had caused a spasm of unrest in French politics, which had led to changes in the French government and, crucially, changes at the head of the French army. This man, Joseph Joffre, who commanded and had been the great figurehead of the French military since 1914, when his victory at the Battle of the Marne had made him a national hero, Joffre was quietly and rather confusingly and clumsily replaced as the supreme commander of the French army. His status was so great he couldn't easily be sacked, but he was very awkwardly moved out of position. It was felt that his vision for another general offensive in 1917 was unacceptable to the French. They already suffered huge casualties through 15 and 16, and the prospect of more of the same in 1917 simply wasn't appealing to the French government, which was becoming desperately worried about its own manpower situation. In his place came this man, Robert Nivelle, younger, more dynamic, and a hero of Verdun. Just as Joffre had been a hero of the Battle of the Marne in 1914, Nivelle had made his name at Verdun, and particularly in the dramatic and dynamic, albeit comparatively small-scale, counterattacks that had retaken lost territory in the latter half of 1916. And whereas Joffre was seen as the ideal man for 1914 and the type of warfare that had existed then, Nivelle was seen as the ideal man for the new conditions of trench warfare, and a man who seemed to have the secret to unlocking the trench lines. And crucially, Nivelle was a contrast in a personal level to Joffre, where Joffre was rather inarticulate, where he didn't speak good English, or barely any English at all, and where he tended to keep his cards rather close to his chest. Nivelle was charismatic, he was dual linguist, he could speak English and French both very fluently. Well, obviously French was his native tongue, but he could speak English fluently too. He was charismatic, he was energetic, and he was personable, and he was different. He was the right man for Allied leaders who were looking for a new option. And Nivelle sold these new ideas, not merely to the French government, but also to the British government. And his idea was a tremendously bold one. He preached that he'd discovered the keys to unlocking the German trench system, and he'd done so at the Battle of Verdun, a combination of careful artillery bombardment and skillful infantry assaults. And now in early 1917, with the French armoured branch now becoming ready for action, he thought this combination of tanks, skilled infantry and armour would be the key to not merely unlocking the German trench system, but shattering it entirely. He promised a rupture of the German lines in 48 hours that would lead, in his words, to a splendid harvest of glory, breaking apart the Western Front and returning manoeuvre warfare to a battlefield that had been deadlocked for 2 years by this stage. His ambition, his charisma, his energy felt like a breath of fresh air to British and French politicians who were rejecting the idea of a new general offensive. In some ways, Nivelle's idea was actually a return to the general offensive concept. And here we have a map, actually, of the Western Front in 1917. And what I'd like you to look at is this area here. The dashed line here is the bulge, the Neuenn salient, which had been left at the end of the Battle of the Somme. And you can see it's a rather awkward position for the Germans. They've been pushed back. They've got bulges and problems in their line. The general offensive concept, as devised by Joffre, was to attack the shoulders of this salient, the French in the south and the British in the north, trying to create a position where this salient would be squeezed. That would give the Germans a difficult decision. They could either try and cling on and risk having all these troops here get cut off, or they could abandon the salient, thereby surrendering a large tract of French territory and, of course, allowing the Allies to win a significant victory. Nivelle retained the idea of an attack on the shoulders of the salient, but almost immediately things went wrong. Castro mines back to the Hindenburg Line, construction of which had begun in September 1916. By February 1917, early March 1917, it was ready, and the new line is this thick line running along here. This was the new position. In a skillful, albeit brutal and in many ways appalling Operation Albrecht, the Germans fell back secretly from the Noyen salient to their new fortifications in the Hindenburg Line, devastating the terrain in between so comprehensively it staggered the soldiers who moved through this wasteland that had been created as the Germans fell back. The abandonment of the Noyen salient damaged Nivelle's plan immediately, because now he would no longer be assaulting the shoulders with the potential of collapsing a vulnerable salient. Instead, he'd be attacking into a pretty stiff German position, which was going to be heavily defended, and the idea of encircling it or breaking into it was rather vague, shall we say. Nevertheless, Nivelle clung to this idea, and he slightly revised his plan. Whereas the original general offensive concept had seen a vision of the British and the French cracking the shoulders and encircling the Germans here, Nivelle's new offensive instead suggested the British should launch a diversionary attack here at Arras. This is how the British are drawn towards Arras, that would draw in German reserves. This attack would go off 3 days before his own offensive would be launched down here at the Aisne River, at the Chemin des Dames, the Ladies' Walk, a ridgeline where the British Army had fought in 1914. The French army would break across the Chemin des Dames, seize the high ground, and they would then be in a position to roll up the Hindenburg Line and indeed break out to the north, encircling and turning this line. As the German line collapsed, the British would be able to encircle it from the south or indeed turn to the north. And the entire German position would crumble into dust, and maneuver warfare would be restored. Nivelle had originally wanted this offensive to be launched in February, but the appalling winter of 1916-17, the coldest of the First World War, prevented this happening. And the withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line made this now an extremely risky proposition. Rather than attacking vulnerable edges of the salient, instead, British and French forces would be attacking into the teeth of very formidable German defences. Nevertheless, the ambition and the energy and the charisma of Nivelle and his promise of doing something different was enough to win over doubting British and French politicians, and particularly win over Lloyd George. Lloyd George, as we've heard, was looking for a new option. He was keen to avoid another Somme. The Italian option had proved a dead end. Nivelle's option, though, tempted him greatly. And one thing that Nivelle said to Lloyd George that particularly intrigued him was that if the offensive didn't work, it could be called off after 48 hours. And that caught Lloyd George's imagination, because he did not want another month-long grinding attritional battle as the Somme would be. The idea the battle could be shut down after 48 hours if it had gone wrong made it look to Lloyd George like a relatively low-cost gamble. And increasingly enraptured with Nivelle's vision, and indeed feeling the energy that was buzzing through the French government at the idea of it too, Lloyd George made a gamble beyond accepting the idea of the Nivelle offensive. He then decided to try and use Nivelle as a way to control his own generals. Lloyd George had little regard for either his Chief of the Imperial General Staff, William Robertson, or his Commander-in-Chief on the Western Front, Douglas Haig. And he feared that Douglas Haig in particular, left uncontrolled, and remember Lloyd George has come into the government at least partially on a promise he's going to have more control over the military. Lloyd George feared that Haig, left uncontrolled, left off the reins, would simply launch another great endless offensive like at the Somme. And Lloyd George saw as a way of controlling Douglas Haig could be to place him under the command of Robert Nivelle, effectively create a unified Allied command structure. To do this was extremely daring, especially the manner in which Lloyd George chose to do it, which was essentially to lure Haig and Robertson into an ambush at the Calais Conference of February 1917. Lloyd George had made private agreement with Nivelle that Nivelle would ask at the conference to have overall command of the British Army as well as his own French forces. But Nivelle himself seemed to get stage fright at this conference, and he beat around the bush, and he didn't really make his point particularly clear, much to Lloyd George's frustration, until very, very late on. And of course, Robertson and Haig learning they were to be placed under French command, reacted with absolute fury. And more than just the act of being placed under French command, it was the way in which they'd been set up. They'd been lured to a conference and they had been ambushed by Lloyd George in this respect. The mood at this stage between these men was appalling. In fact, they wouldn't speak to each other. Robertson and Lloyd George both had sleepless nights because they were so angry and so frustrated with one another. And eventually a compromise agreement was arranged whereby Haig agreed that he would cooperate closely with Nivelle and would somewhat subordinate his army to French command. Nivelle then made things a lot worse by actually acting pompously, being very difficult towards Haig, being very difficult towards the British army. And this decision of Lloyd George to try and do this, try and place the British under Nivelle, would sour civil-military relations for the entirety of 1917 and would gravely weaken Lloyd George's ability to control his generals, because his decision to place British forces under Nivelle, who would of course be exposed ultimately as not necessarily a fraud, but a man whose ambition far outweighed his ability. That exposure, that revelation of disaster that would occur in April 1917 made Lloyd George look desperately foolish. It made him look, shall we say, sneaky. It made him look treacherous. And ultimately, it made him look wrong-headed. He had backed the wrong horse by backing Nivelle. And it was something for which Haig and Robertson would never forgive him. And it would damage civil military relations and play a major role in the problems that would occur later in the year at Third Ypres. But that's a story perhaps for another day. What we can say is that this decision and the results that arose from it committed Haig, and by extension Robertson, who was chief of the Imperial General Staff, it committed Haig to participating in Nivelle's offensive by launching his own offensive at Arras. Now, this was something of an expansion of, or variation on, a plan that had been loosely agreed in 1916, as we've heard, to attack the Noyen salient shoulder. But now that this was rather different, rather than trying to batter into a salient, instead the BEF was going to be launched at a pretty tough portion of the German line, with the expectation that this was not going to seek a breakthrough. Instead, this was, in some ways, a very large-scale diversionary operation designed to pin down German reserves, to draw German attention, to cause the Germans to react to this offensive, and allow the French to then strike the decisive blow at the River Aisne, at the Chemins des Dames. This was not what Haig or Robertson ideally would have wanted. Haig still dreamt of an offensive in Flanders, which might be able to liberate the Belgian ports, as did Robertson, Robertson backed that idea and thought it would be better for Britain and indeed the Empire if Belgium and the Belgian ports could be brought under control. The offensive at Arras was done in the interests, therefore, of coalition, and it was part of this wider plan of Nivelle's, who thought that if the British could just draw off those German reserves, then his own methods would shatter the German army at the River Aisne, and the rest would simply fall into place. Of course, history would prove Nivelle wrong, and his disastrous offensive would ultimately shake the French army to its core, leading to a series of mutinies, which would remove the French army as an offensive instrument for the remainder of virtually the entirety of 1917. But for the British army, the battle lines for the Battle of Arras were set. It would be the loyal ally. It would launch its offensive here to draw off German reserves. And the rest, of course, is history. I hope this has given you a good feel for how and why the British Army came to be fighting at Arras and the complex political picture that actually informed these decisions. And now I hope that you'll enjoy the rest of the conference and learn a lot more about the actual Battle of Vimy Ridge. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right. Thank you very much for Dr. Spencer Jones and his introduction to 1917 strategy, and in particular, the Battle of Arras there. So I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, and this is Dr. Patrick Brennan, Pat Brennan of the University of Calgary. Dr. Brennan earned his PhD at York University in Toronto and has been a professor in the history department of the University of Calgary since 1989. His interests focus on the impact of the Great War on Canada, and he is currently writing a history of one of Calgary's regiments. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Brennan.
Thank you, Peter. I should just emphasize to people, I am no longer, I'm an emeritus professor now. I retired a few years ago, but the academic never dies. I really appreciate the opportunity tonight to speak to people, because it sort of reminds me of lovely days as a professor when you had a whole bunch of interesting people listening to you, something of a captive audience. I realize not entirely captive tonight, but anyway, I hope I make it worth your while. I'm going to talk about the Battle of Vimy Ridge in my own title, some salient aspects, and I'm really going to pose a series of questions, about 7 questions, and then sort of answer them. One of the points I want to raise is that some of the elements that, at least a part of the accepted wisdom about the Battle of Vimy Ridge, certainly that are prevalent in popular history and often in academic history as well. I'm going to take to task some of these points, and at no point do I want anybody to think, well, my goodness, I'm trying to be an iconoclast here, and it's not that. Battle of Vimy Ridge was an enormous Canadian achievement, and it doesn't need untoward embellishment. It stands on its own feet. So that's really what I'm trying to do, is to give credit where credit is due, and again, give some of the larger context of what was going on, at least within the battle itself. So what was at stake? Operationally, well, as has already been pointed out, this was part, not a small part, but nonetheless part of a larger British offensive at Arras, which dragged on for over a month and turned out rather badly. Ended up looking more like the Battle of Somme than anything new by the time it was over. But anyway, the northern flank of the BEF's Arras offensive in April 1917, that's Vimy Ridge, and the role of Horn's First Army and Byng's Corps within that army, the Canadian Corps, and one British supporting division was to, in fact, capture that ridge and at the very beginning and neutralize it as, if nothing else, a German observation position to shell British rear areas to the south, and also to prevent, in a worst case scenario, some sort of German counterattack. So that was the operational intention. More broadly, like the Arras offensive itself, it was going to test the new attacking doctrine that had been developed from the Somme experiences, the not very happy Somme experiences, in 1916. And much thought had been gone into by British, Canadian, Australian senior officers and others in the aftermath, or during even, and certainly in the aftermath during the winter of 1916-17, as to how to fight better, because the Somme, from Allied point of view, from the British Empire point of view, was at best a Pyrrhic victory, and no too many Pyrrhic victories and you end up being the loser. So there was a new doctrine that emerged, which has been called bite and hold attacks, basically a set piece attack where you would use your artillery to literally tear off a piece of the enemy's defensive line and then occupy the ground and hold it with men. The reverse, really, what we're trying to do at the Somme, which was take the ground with men and hold it with artillery. So artillery was going to do a lot of the taking. The infantry would occupy it, and then hopefully the Germans would cooperate, as they usually did, by counterattacking. That was their strategy, and then they would be the attrition would start working against the Germans. The attackers would lose men, of course, initially, but the attrition would start working against the Germans during this counterattack phase. The key was to not go too far. The Allies had had a tremendous tendency up until the new doctrine of bite and hold was adopted to grasp defeat from the jaws of victory by taking initial successes as an indication that they could rupture the German lines completely and break through. And you've already seen examples of that being discussed for 1917 by Robert Naval. The Canadian context established the worth of the new command structure and the accompanying internal reforms of the Canadian Corps, which had been underway since the late spring of 1916. And I'm going to talk to a bit about this toward the end. But suffice to say, the end of the malign influence of Sam Hughes as Minister of Militia and Defense, the introduction of meritocracy to the Canadian Corps, particularly its senior echelons, and so on. Okay, so to test this new doctrine, the British in general were interested in that. It had not been tried out, and there was great hope vested in bite and hold attacks as a style of offensive in a trench warfare situation. And then in the Canadian context, there was really a question about could the problems that ailed the Canadian Corps up to that time, which had been quite severe, had they been remediated by these other reforms? What did the Germans think? Well, prior to the attack, there was remarkably little confidence actually in the German army and German high command that Vimy could be held. There was a general feeling by those close to the sector that any determined assault, especially if it enjoyed initial success, early success, would in fact be victorious. There was no sense that it was the most formidably defended position on the Western Front, et cetera, sometimes one reads in Canadian accounts. After the attack, Germans saw it as a saw-off. It appears on the battle honors of German regiments that were there, which usually don't put your defeats on there. But it was certainly not seen as a loss. Now, some of this may have been rationalization to a point, but I think it also bears contemplating that the Germans thought they'd done pretty well, all things considered, because their expectations were that it's about as well as they could probably do. It was certainly not seen as a disastrous defeat. So why was Vimy Ridge a victory? I mean, clearly it was a victory, a sound plan. It was well aligned, that is, the plan was well aligned with Western Front combat realities. And while challenging, it was definitely a challenging objective, it was clearly doable. Lots of preparation time, 3 months plus in some cases. It's worth remembering when one looks at Vimy and all the preparatory work and so on, the planning, the artillery plan, the logistics and so on and so forth, that they had 3 months to do this, and it took 3 months to do it properly. But in 1918, during the 100 Days campaign, Battle of Vimy Ridge, in the case of the Canadian Corps, battles of Vimy Ridge, Drocourt Queant Line, and Canal du Nord, we did this thing 3 times in 2 months. And in the case of Vimy Ridge, 1 week's preparation to do the artillery plan and so on. So we got very good at this kind of bite and hold attack, okay? Besides lots of preparation time, I got down here, I have it 3 times. Artillery. The key to bite and hold attack doctrine was artillery superiority on steroids, which is what the British were developing during the winter of 1916-17. And in fact, it would become more and more pronounced in the rest of 1917 and 1918. The key to bite and hold attacks was artillery superiority, overwhelming artillery superiority. And we had that. And in the British way of assigning extra artillery resources to attacking formations and then not leaving them there. In other words, you had what you came with, divisional artillery and so on, a little bit of extra corps artillery in the case of the Canadian Corps, but 2/3 of the heavy artillery and 2/3 of the field artillery, which were used for counter battery work and barrage work at Vimy, were in fact British. It's also worth remembering that it wasn't entirely a Canadian operation. Anglo-Canadian actions, why was Vimy a victory? Preliminary bombardment, I'm not going to go into the details of the attack doctrine, but preliminary bombardment was exceptionally well done. Counter battery program was exceptionally well done. Severe degrading of German defenses. The defenses were severely degraded before the infantry were thrown into the battle. Anglo-Canadian actions, infantry attack in stages, the leapfrogging, in other words, using the fresh troops for each stage of the attack, expert use of creeping barrages. These were all, I might add, these were all things that were part of bite and hold doctrine and were being used by the British and the Australians. Canadians, as we'll see, embraced this kind of change doctrine with a passion, but it was British doctrine, and the British attacks were doing it. The first few days of the Arras offensive also demonstrated this new doctrine, and in fact was very successful. It's when the British continued to press and press and press over the weeks that things deteriorated. Planning for contingencies. Seems like common sense, but it hadn't been done to the degree it should have been done before in previous battles, and bite and hold called for that. And I might add the command of the Canadian Corps, General Byng and his Brigadier General Staff, his Principal Staff Officer, Percy Radcliffe, also embraced this idea in spades. Conservative objectives. It was an ambitious attack plan, but it was conservative. It was all bite and hold attacks where you're going to go as far as your own artillery could carry you and no farther. No matter how good things looked, you weren't going to be seduced into feeling you'd broken through and then get counterattacked in unprepared positions and so on. So there were conservative objectives, difficult objectives, but conservative objectives. There was a realization by the Canadian and British generals commanding the operation that the infantry had to show initiative, a lot of initiative, after the inevitable breakdown of communications in attacks. For a cell phone in the First World War. They're still using runners, pigeons, et cetera, to communicate in the First World War. Communications always broke down at the sharp end. And this had led to confusion in the past. Now, basically, we're going to make a merit out of necessity, which is to say they were going to train infantry units, particularly companies and platoons, small units, to be self-sufficient and to act independently to carry the offensive forward. So there was a recognition of sort of reality and how to make a merit out of it. Okay. German actions, inability, that is to say, what were the German contributions to the victory of Vimy Ridge? Well, inability to deploy counterattacking forces, which are the heart of German defensive doctrine. They had adopted in the aftermath of the Somme a less rigid form of defense, elastic defense. Unfortunately, they couldn't implement it at Vimy because of geography. In other words, it was too much up and down. And the result was that there was a very strong line, although we degraded it considerably with artillery before the attack. But it was thin, it was narrow, and the German reserves were far, far too far to the rear, in some cases 25 kilometers to the rear, to be brought up in a suitable time to make a difference in terms of counterattacking. That wasn't, as I said, largely as a result of not of German overconfidence, but just of the geography. So what looked like a very formidable position in some ways had its inherent weaknesses. So the Vimy Ridge attack plan, whose was it? My students used to tell me after reading a lot of popular Canadian history that it was in fact Arthur Currie, who was a divisional commander, one of the 4 divisional commanders and the best of them, and a very bright man, and who would take over command of the Corps in June, several months after the Vimy attack, and lead it to the end of the war. But in fact, there was input from throughout the Corps into planning for the attack, but ultimately it followed British Expeditionary Force doctrine, this bite and hold doctrine. What he had was a commanding officer, Julian Byng, who was a tremendous trainer of men and handler of men, and got the most out of his subordinates, so was open to the subordinates' views and so on, as was his Brigadier General, General Staff, his Chief Staff Officer, Percy Radcliffe. And these were 2 British officers who had been parachuted into the Canadian Corps in the late spring of 1916 to try to save it from itself, so to speak. But there's no question Byng and Radcliffe's thumbprints are all over the planning. And yes, Currie and others, but there's no doubt that Byng was an active hands-on Corps commander. The role of Arthur Currie, again, he was the principal other person to involve, senior commander to be involved in planning, simply because he was very good, and Byng greatly admired him and was in a sense mentoring him to take over the Corps command eventually. And so Currie deserves an awful lot of credit, but he was not, Byng wasn't just sitting there on his thumbs. Byng was in charge, and Radcliffe, always a good staff officer behind every successful general. And Currie certainly plays a leading role as well. And that person is sometimes forgotten, a Canadian artillery expert, Andrew McNaughton, would go on to command the Canadian Army for a while, at least overseas during World War II. Andy McNaughton was counter-battery staff officer, which means he was in charge of basically the heavy artillery. There was, in fact, a British general named Massey who was in charge of the heavy artillery. Massey was sick all the time. And basically, as is often the case in armies, the staff officer, in fact, is pulling the strings. And McNaughton was a brilliant artillery officer. He was the most innovative Canadian officer produced in the war, senior Canadian officer. It had not been a regulation or a practice in the Canadian Corps, originating with the government in Ottawa, that Canadian officers would not be promoted outside the Corps. British officers would be brought in if they were needed, but Canadian officers would not be promoted outside the Corps. McNaughton would have been at Hague's headquarters. He was every bit the equal of the artillery innovators at general headquarters, the British artillery initiators like the also named Hague, but not the same man as Douglas. How important was success at Vimy Ridge? In other words, we get a success, we win a success on our merits. How important was it? Well, to the BEF, the key thing was simply, it wasn't the Canadian nation building, I can assure you that. For them, it was a vindication of bite and hold attack doctrine. A great deal of had been invested in this new doctrine and in training the artillery and the infantry to carry it out, and that had to be tried. And a lot rode on that because not everybody was convinced in the BEF, including some of the Canadian commanders, that it was the way to go. That it was time to abandon the old methods. They should be tried again and just nuanced differently, more, have tried more, this kind of thing. And it's very difficult to change a doctrine right in the middle of a war. Anyway, it had to be tried, and had it failed, that would have been it for Bite-and-hold attacks. And as it turns out, that doctrine was very effective, given the relatively blunt instruments that were available in the First World War to carry out attacks. Bite-and-hold was in fact a really good idea. Okay, so the British were very interested in its being vindicated. It was vindicated in the early stages of the larger Arras offensive. As I said, thereafter it became rather obscure whether it worked or not. Vimy was a really nice strapped in a bow kind of attack. There was no question that Bite-and-hold had worked extremely well at Vimy. And so that was, it's no reason, there was no accident rather that practically every senior British commander came to tour the battlefield afterwards and be briefed on exactly what we had done and so on and so forth. To the Canadian Corps, that, yes, but there were other things, of course, we understand. It was the first clear victory that the Canadian Corps won. Up to that time, Canadian military achievements had been checkered. They had been, and it was expected that it would take a while for the Army to learn, and particularly its Canadian officers to learn. Most of them were amateurs. But nonetheless, there were other problems to do with lack of meritocracy, Sam Hughes's dictatorship over the Army, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of bad things happened in the Army. The British were not, the British wanted manpower, but they wanted effective units, and the Canadian Corps wasn't terribly effective. Hence sending Byng and Radcliffe and various others to try to reform it the previous year. So a clear victory. It was a clear victory. There's just no way any Canadian in the Corps could look at that and say we'd done really well. Okay, a great morale boost for officers and men. The Corps never lost a game. I mean, they had some rocky periods in battles for sure, but I mean, they never lost again. And one can't underestimate the effect that had on morale. And lastly, the question I want to raise is, was there anything, excuse me, uniquely or specifically Canadian about the Vimy Ridge attack? I'm going to quote here from, of all places, Wikipedia, but it's actually an exceptionally good article in terms of the research and analysis in Wikipedia on Vimy Ridge. But the quote I have here is, historians attribute the success of the Canadian Corps to technical and tactical innovation. Tick mark, yes. Meticulous planning, yes. Powerful artillery support and extensive training, yes. As well as German inability to properly apply defense in depth. Yes, okay. The problem is, and I saw this over and over again and with my students, again, reading Canadian sources, that the implication there is that it was uniquely Canadian, that these kinds of techniques, the extensive preparation and so on, the expert use of massed artillery, all of this stuff was unique to the Canadians, and that's simply wrong. It was the British Expeditionary Force doctrine, which had been shaped and also was adopted by the two principal Dominion contingents, the Australian Imperial Force and the Canadian Expeditionary Force. Followed the BEF Bite-and-hold doctrine, that is to say, the Vimy plan and the Vimy execution followed BEF Bite-and-hold doctrine to the T, both with respect to infantry and artillery doctrine. The thumbprint of Byng and Radcliffe on Corps leadership all the way down to battalion command was manifest, and British staff work throughout. We forget that virtually all the senior staff officers and most of the middle-ranking staff officers were British. And at a time when the British Army was expanding and needed all the staff officers it had, it was very generous in giving as many as it did to the Canadian Corps. And they knew the Canadians could be something if they could get their act together. It would be a major contributor because of the large size of the Corps. And so there was their own interest. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that a relatively small number of British professionals had an enormous impact on the training and professionalization of the Canadian Corps, which was really on display at the Battle of Vimy Ridge. Why has the debt of British expertise been downplayed? Still downplayed, frankly, although less than it used to be. If you're going to have a birth of a nation and so on, if the reason the Canadians do well is because they shed their colonial shackles, it's pretty hard to point to accepting British commanders, British staff officers, adopting basically British doctrine. They had to do these things, that is to say, the doctrine, because the army, was one great imperial alliance, and they had to be interchangeable parts. How anybody could think the Canadians could do something different and still function effectively in the BEF. But anyway, I think it has to do with this kind of post-war nationalist business. Willingness of Canadian officers to embrace new infantry tactics. I think they deserve a lot of credit. I've done a lot of studying this myself, and these amateur warriors, and I mean that as a compliment, they weren't professionally trained soldiers, they're brigadiers, divisional commanders, battalion commanders, artillery commanders, and so on, had been running lumber yards and banks and construction companies and large-scale firearms and law offices and so on only 2 years earlier. They had a lot to learn. They had more to learn than British professionals did, but they had a lot less to forget too. And so they, in the hands of somebody like Byng, or people like Byng and Radcliffe, who were great teachers and saw the potential of Canadian leadership in the Corps. This was a marriage made in heaven, and there were capable non-professionals that mastered the art of battle and the art of war. That was certainly apparent by Vimy. Enthusiasm, esprit de corps. There's no doubt the Canadians, as with the Australians, had a certain level of enthusiasm, and certainly esprit de corps. The beginnings of a sort of a nationalism in some cases was at work, and all these things kind of cheered them on. They were volunteers and so on. Finally, was there anything, continuing on that theme, never lose sight of the fact that there's big stuff going on beyond Borden's government's reform of the Canadian Expeditionary Force and of its fighting arm, the Canadian Corps, beginning in late spring 1916, placing military operations in the hands of military and civilian professionals, meant that for the first time, the total equaled the sum of the parts for the Canadian Corps. And thereafter, the total would be greater than the sum of the parts. It was the end of amateurism at 1916 and into early 1917, and the results were manifestly apparent at Vimy. The malign influence of the Mullah, as many Army officers refer to Sam Hughes, the Minister of Militia and Defense. His megalomania ended. He was basically cashiered. And as I say, meritocracy was introduced. It unlocked the potential of the Canadian Army. It showed at Vimy that this potential was being unlocked. And it was more and more clear as the war went on over the next 18 months. Canadian Corps went from success to success and became a more formidable military weapon by the fall of 1918 than it had certainly been at the time of Vimy, which was pretty formidable enough. Anyway, I finished my comments now, and I hand it back to Peter.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brennan. That was a great look at the Canadian involvement in Vimy, and a different look than as you said, than I think we get from the traditional textbooks. We can discuss much more of this during the questions. So for those, please post any questions you have in the chat, and we'll start to get them ready for that period. I now have the distinct pleasure of introducing Dr. Geoff Bird. Dr. Bird, he's going to talk about Vimy Ridge in the context of Remembrance. He's a professor at Royal Roads University. He earned his PhD at Brighton University in the United Kingdom and has held various positions at Royal Roads, including director and program head. He is the project lead of the War Heritage Initiative and has produced over 30 short documentaries focused on commemoration in Canada. And those are available on the Royal Roads website or on the Valour Canada site. You're gracious enough to share them with us so we can promote them to schools. He's currently working on a documentary about the Battle of Kitchener's Wood, which was part of the First World War, Second Battle of Ypres. And I'd ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Bird. We'll hand over control to you.
Well, thanks, Peter. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Okay, great. And you can see the screen. I just want to make sure.
Yeah, we can see the screen.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for joining us this evening on this important anniversary. And today I have the pleasure of talking about Vimy Ridge from the perspective of remembrance. So this takes us into the post-war era, the past 104 years. In the focus of 30 minutes, I'm just going to focus on three broad areas. I've been involved very much with remembrance and commemoration at Vimy, particularly as a researcher in 2007, and then as an organizer in 2017. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about those two anniversaries and the lessons learned from those. We'll then dive into the, some points that have been alluded to already, particularly by Pat, with regard to the politics of remembrance in Vimy. So we'll spend a little bit of time on that, and then we'll step into some concluding thoughts. So this is the challenge that was placed before a group of scholars when we were thinking about the 2017 commemoration. And the question was this: what should we do with 10,000 Canadian students commemorating the Battle of Vimy Ridge? And the diagram I'm showing you is the exposition site, which is in the city of Arras, just close to Vimy Ridge. And it's, as you can see, an open space. And the task was, okay, so they've gone to the commemoration on the 9th, and on the 10th, what should we be doing with them? And I think this goes to the very heart of the question of remembrance: is what are we doing with remembrance, and what is it used for? And so these are big questions that we won't be able to cover in depth here. But I wanted to show you some of the practicalities and some of the decisions made around education that really were the gist of the 2017 experience. So many of you have read these books, and I thought I would just note them because they're certainly referenced tonight in different ways. And the 2007 book, Vimy Ridge, A Canadian Reassessment, has a range of different authors that cover different aspects of the battle, as well as the remembrance and commemorative era. We, of course, have Tim Cook's famous book on Vimy, The Battle and the Legend, which is 2017. And probably the most controversial of the three here is the Vimy Trap, which we'll talk a little bit about. In a broader context, when we think about war, memory, and commemoration, there are so many books that we can consider and we can draw on. And I mention these because I know some of you are very interested in exploring this further. One of the more recent ones that I've enjoyed reading is War Beyond Words by Jay Winter. And many of you know Jay Winter for the various books that he's compiled, either as the primary author or as an editor. The Cambridge History of the First World War is a recent effort. The Rites of Spring, a book that was first published in 1990 by Moses Eksteins, a professor at University of Toronto, and a fantastic book. Not specifically, none of these books are specific to Canada, except, of course, the Jonathan Vance book. But it's a broader consideration of the evolution of memory after the war. Again, Jay Winter, clearly I'm a fan of his, a book called Remembering War, which explores some of the challenges and ways we can think about remembrance, and a very intriguing consideration. Finally, Jonathan Vance's book, Death So Noble, about 1997, and certainly focusing on the Canadian experience in the post-war years. And so to those of you that are interested in reading more, I suggest these. So we'll just journey back into time, not all the way to 1917, but to 1990. And there's me in the middle there. And I actually started off as a guide at Vimy Ridge. It wasn't my first time to Vimy. I had visited the park a few years earlier and was just possessed that I wanted to work there as a guide. And so I had the opportunity in 1990. And so this experience I've had around commemoration and remembrance has been as not only an organizer in 2017, but as a heritage guide, or we could say a storyteller, back in 1990. So I'm going to just draw on some of those experiences in a little while. But and I know I'm going to concern all my Army friends in the room that I was in the Navy. So you have a naval officer who's telling the story of Vimy. But all I mention this is just to say that a range of experiences influence how we tell these stories. And I note that I have some military experience, not a lot, but certainly gives me a certain perspective that some of us have, some of us don't have, and others will have different ways that we interpret the Vimy site and how we commemorate it. I spent a lot of time working in Vimy Ridge, and in this particular picture, we can see the undercarriage of a B-52 bomber in a lake here in Hanoi. And in my work around the world, I always found myself visiting sites of war memory and just intrigued at the power of these sites. I'm working at Royal Roads University as a professor, which is, of course, also has its own military heritage as a naval college during the Second World War, and afterwards as a military college. And what I found my work in research focusing on is sites of war memory. And here we are at a beach, which if we didn't know it's Omaha Beach, we would just see it as looks like a nice place for a picnic. But definitely when you start calling it a name like Omaha Beach, our relationship to it changes. The meaning that we draw from this place changes. And so this has been my study over the past 10 years. I run the War Heritage Research Initiative, which involves a range of documentary work and events that we hold. And you can certainly visit the site at warheritage.royalroads.ca, and you'll see a range of documentary themes there, all focused on a site of memory and a storyteller, a guardian of remembrance. I'd like to point out this little picture here of a fellow by the name of Emmanuel Hahn. And he's actually a student of Walter Allward, and an intriguing sculptor he was, particularly in the 1920s and 30s, and his influence on sculpting some of the most famous memorials that we have across Canada. One of the big questions that I work with is this whole thing around, is there a right and a wrong way to remember? So is there a way that we can remember well? And we're going to speak about that a little later on in this presentation. And I present this picture to you because often this is a point of contention when we see people dress up in military uniforms. This is in Normandy, the D-Day commemorations about a decade ago. And these are actually Dutch visitors wearing uniforms of the Lincoln and Welland Regiment at a D-Day commemoration. And it was that particular regiment that liberated their town in Holland. And annually they would wear their uniform and come to Normandy to celebrate liberation. So sometimes things aren't as evident as they seem. So let's get back to this question of what should we do with 10,000 Canadian youth and a big open space on the 10th of April, 2017. To help me tell you this story, I'm going to show you a video here, and I'm going to ask Peter, if you don't hear the sound, to just let me know and I will restart, okay?
A century ago, as dawn broke over Vimy Ridge, the morning air suddenly exploded with an unholy roar. It was the sound of 15,000 Canadians surging into battle. Today, 100 years later, we honor their eternal sacrifice.
The events of that day saw the 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps serving together for the first time to take a stand against tyranny and oppression. This was Canada at its best. The Canadians at Vimy embodied the true North, strong and free.
Today, there are no remaining veterans of the First World War. That means it's up to us to remember and to honor their memory, lest we forget.
This trip has been very important to sort of remind both myself and other people, you know, just what it is to be Canadian.
It's strengthened my pride in my country and in my nationality as being Canadian.
I'm more aware and I am more appreciative of what has happened in history. It suddenly becomes something that we're grateful for and a piece of history that we take pride in.
You're seeing it through a different lens, right? You're seeing the ripple effect through the generations. Your worldview is challenged and it just affects you as a person. Like, you can't look at this and come back unchanged.
100 years later, as I look over the faces gathered here, I can't help but feel that a torch is being passed. Let us hold to the grace of the ones who stood by their country. This is why we're here, why we remember.
So that was a quick snapshot of the commemoration 2017. As you noticed, it was essentially a 3-minute piece by Education First Tours, a Swiss-based tour company that specializes in youth tours. And they were the lead agency for organizing the exposition. They hired a range of Canadian consultants and scholars to help with the design of the site and to ensure that the content at the expo site aligned with Canadian curriculum. So a few pictures here of what it was really like on the day. I'm sure there's some here that were actually there. We started early. Actually, I was with a bunch of Canadian school teachers and Governor General Award history teachers. We were part of a special group with Education First Tours. My work had been done, so I was essentially guiding this group. And we started off with a presentation by Stephen Lewis that morning, who many of you know is former ambassador for Canada at the United Nations, a politician in Ontario for before that, but certainly known for his international work. We then made our way to the buses. And we saw this amazing mobilization, again, by Education First Tours, of getting people up to the park itself. This went through the morning, and the event actually started about 3 o'clock. And it was a hot day. And by the time the event started, I think a lot of the students were missing the enthusiasm that they had first thing in the morning. Nevertheless, people persevered. And it was a powerful day. It was more made for television than it was for the audience that were present. And that's an interesting thing, because I think obviously there was an intention to make this as an event that was going to be televised across the country. There were 25,000 people there for the 2017 event. And there was about 10,000 youth, as I mentioned. It was quite a day, and by the end of it, there was certainly struggles getting off the ridge, and there was various issues that happened on the day that I'm sure organizers would rethink if when we do it again. But it really showed that there was such an energy amongst Canadians who wanted to be there and who wanted to commemorate on site at Vimy. So I just spoke about the Vimy Expo briefly, and certainly what I found was that people were very tired by the end of the day. And I think if people walked away from Vimy Ridge, they would have said, well, is there more? Particularly youth who were trying to make meaning of the experience that they had. And the Vimy Expo actually was a way to take the ideas of the Vimy Ridge experience and move from the history of it to thinking about how it's relevant in 2017, in the 21st century. What are the learnings that we can take from Vimy and use them to tackle some of the world's challenges. And that's what really the expo was about. It had a simple structure of the past, where we are now, and the future. And from the Vimy experience, all of those issues were discussed. So what do we learn from the 2017 commemoration? War Remembrance involves teaching and learning. This is more about pedagogy than anything else. Now that the veteran generation has passed on, and something that we're going to work with when we get to that point with Second World War veterans, is that when we talk about remembering, we're actually talking about education. And of course, we're talking about the rituals that go along with commemoration, but it also starts with teaching not only about what happened, but the meaning of it and its significance today. Relevance is certainly a key element. Traveling to sites is particularly important. And while this is something that is a cost and obviously not available to everyone, it certainly has quite a profound and often resonant impact on those people that visit battlefields. I'd like to note that the Canadian government played a role in the commemoration at Vimy, as in they paid for that, but it was the private sector that led the expo and the overall itinerary design, teaching, and learning for Canadian youth. Sure, they hired people like myself. University of Toronto Department of Education was very actively involved as a lead agency. But we often consider, and I know with the Vimy Trap book, there's often this reference that the Canadian government spent a lot of money on the First World War centenary. And in fact, they did not. Certainly the Canada 150 event and Vimy fell in 2017 and was part of that. And so obviously it did receive some money for that. There was a new interpretive center constructed. But overall, we need to think about how this whole thing around commemoration starts to link with what Jay Winter refers to as the business of remembrance. That can be a concern to many, and certainly is a concern to me. But we are in this point now where governments are finding less, less drive to actually spend vast amounts of money to get people to these sites, or to spend a lot of money on memorialization and commemoration. But I'll note that Vimy and remembering Vimy has evolved with the 21st century. And the histories and learnings of that battle are readily used to tackle today's problems. And that's what we did at the expo. So, for example, talks around how to create innovation, how to tackle how to adapt to challenges, what kind of education needs to be done in order to make the world a better place. These kinds of things are maybe what we might draw from what General Hilliard called the Vimy effect, which I'm going to speak to in a moment. But definitely there are ways that remembrance goes beyond the very important moments of silence and the rituals that we associate with it. So let's step into the next part of this. Is the whole idea of the politics of remembrance. And you can't find a better place than Vimy Ridge to talk about the politics of remembrance. And politics of remembrance is about the often found debates that we have around why we remember and what are we remembering and is it important to remember? And obviously we have various interpretations. And I just want to start with this whole thing of me being a guide back in 1990 and what that was like. The summer of 1990, we actually had the Meech Lake Accord, if you remember that whole idea, going on at the same time. And so we were in this park and we had a lot of people asking about the future of Canada. And it was a very powerful place to be to discuss that idea of what was happening to the future of Canada when you're standing in the mythology of where Canada was born. The book of the time was Pierre Berton's book, which we often look at as having a general introduction to Vimy, but filled with a lot of inaccuracies and the mythology around the creation of Canada. And certainly when we read Tim Cook's book, he says, you can't blame everything on Pierre Berton's book. It does have some value, but the whole idea of the birth of a nation is something that's grown well over time. But in 1990, it was well and truly in play. We had a script that we had to memorize. We arrived on our first day and we had to repeat it to the superintendent, both in English and French. And if you couldn't do it, you had to follow another guide for a while. It was also the 50th anniversary of the invasion of France. We had buses of German veterans on their way to Paris. We had buses of British veterans on their way to Dunkirk. And they all seemed to come through Vimy Ridge to visit. And as guides, we were giving tunnel tours, we were giving tours of the memorial. And what I quickly realized when the Germans arrived is I had very little knowledge of the German story at Vimy. It was a Canadian story. And as Canadian guides, we told that story. A few years later, the Duran group came in and really changed, and I would say transformed, the way the story of Vimy was told. And I think it was an important transformation. We were a range of university students that were doing our best, but there was very little support for the kind of deep conversation that was occurring at the park. Every day was a powerful day. And you could have Canadians show up on one day. You could have veterans of the First World War were still walking around. They would often take over the guiding of the tour. Yeah, I had an English guy who was in the artillery who would pick up a shell in the tunnel, which was to us an artifact and not to be touched. And he would pick it up like he was picking up a baby, where he would show how to calibrate the shell. And it was just incredible. And I think when we think of the loss of the generation, there are so many stories that we lose. So having professional guides, having a real focus on interpretation and the role of the site in storytelling, and basically as a gateway to other places in this area is really important. But so I just touched on that whole thing of in 1990 and the politics of remembrance, there was this whole thing of the birth of the nation. Burton's book was a Bible of sorts in a way. We were also reading Rites of Spring by Moses Ersteins, which I mentioned earlier. But let's just shift back to just after the First World War and the Battle Exploits Memorials Committee, which was given the role of trying to designate which sites would be given national status as a memorial. And you see here the list of different sites in Belgium and France that were identified. And with it came the discussion on what kind of memorial. And we all know about the competition that occurred, and Walter Allward wins the commission to build his inspiring monument and it was chosen at the Vimy Ridge site for a range of reasons. Of course, we know Currie was very concerned about establishing Vimy Ridge as the main national war memorial in Europe. And his concern is that it would overshadow not only all of these national memorials that we see listed here, but all the other ones that didn't make the list. These were seen as the seminal moments in Canadian military history of the First World War. But of course, we all know that there's many more here that are not mentioned. So in this way, we see the first blush of the politics of remembrance, deciding which places would get a proper memorial, like a national memorial, and therefore would receive that attention over time. Many of us know also that in the 1920s, it wasn't Vimy that was the focal point. It was the Second Battle of Ypres. And that was the one that received significant attention and was really where we would talk about the birth of the nation. So it was from the 20s to, say, into the 70s and 80s that you see this transition towards this idea of the birth of the nation. But I just wanted to mention, as much as I was focusing on when I was working at Vimy Ridge and going to the park and trying to pick up and read as much as I could and talk to people, I didn't venture into the eastern battlefields the battlefields to the east of Vimy, until a few years later. And of course, we also know that upwards of 45,000 Canadians were killed and wounded in the last 100 days of the First World War. There's Ontario Cemetery, Quebec Cemetery, Niagara Cemetery. There's Monchy-le-Preux, which is a Newfoundland regiment, a memorial, which, owing to their action on the 15th of April, 1917, is just down the road. And sometimes we can see how the Vimy narrative and the power that Vimy has as a memorial and as a massive park with its trenches and its tunnels and its interpretive center seems to overshadow and almost obliterate the memory of other sites quite nearby. And so I'd like to pose this question around when we say about remembering well and ways we can make this, we can evolve this, is that while we acknowledge and commemorate Vimy today, we also need to acknowledge and commemorate many of the other battles that have occurred. And I want to just acknowledge Peter and Valour Canada for their good work in this regard. As we move a little bit closer to the park, so a lot of those sites that I've just shown you are the sites of the last 100 days. That if you drive from Arras towards Cambrai, you would come across a number of these sites. If we go a little bit closer to the park, but not actually in the park itself, you actually find a range of Vimy-related memorials that are just outside the park boundary. And we have, for example, the 1st Canadian Division's memorial, and I was able to visit this particular memorial again back in 2015 with members of the Calgary Highlanders, and so that was a special opportunity for us to go out into the field, and a place that's not as visited, obviously, as regularly as other sites related to Vimy Ridge. You see here the pine trees and the maple trees in the park. And, a small story here is it wasn't until I read the reassessment of Vimy Ridge, one of the books I mentioned earlier, that I learned that the whole mythology of 11,285 trees planted in the park representing a soldier who died and who had no known grave was false. And so this was in 1990, and the years previous and I think after was often a point that we would speak to. And so you can see how mythology evolves in different ways, and there might be just a slight footnote that we pass on, but certainly the accuracy of the narrative is important before we go on to speak about its meaning. So we have the big park, 100-acre park, but really the focal point in the park is the memorial itself. And I just want to touch on the memorial because it goes to, it sets up the whole mythology legend of Vimy that we are aware of. And this is, I believe this was in 2007, and the sunset ceremony. What I always found with this memorial was the white stone was always changing its mood. If it was a stormy day, and it just seemed that on the Douay Plain, the sun would shine on this monument in the most bizarre of ways. It always made it a very powerful sight. You have the mourners, typically viewed as a mother and father, or typically a mother and father. We have the spirit of sacrifice, certainly drawing on the McCrae poem In Flanders Fields. This was always a powerful one to me. This was sympathy for the victims. This was on the far side of the monument, and very unique for a war memorial to acknowledge the civilian victims in the area. And of course, breaking of the sword. Certainly carrying on that idea of the 1920s of the war to end all wars, and I think captured so powerfully in this allegory. Canada bereft. The figure of Canada as a mother looking over a crypt, which is below. the names on the walls, the 11,285 names of Canadians who died and who have no known grave. And this captures those names that we have in France. Of course, Meningate, it plays that role in Belgium. And in Allward's words, he would speak about the allegorical figures on the pillars themselves. And he described them as figures of truth, faith, justice, charity, knowledge, and peace. Sing the hymn of peace. And these were what he said were the virtues of Canada. And I think they are virtues that we should always aspire to. And I think this is one of the messages that we have in this landscape overseas, are these great lessons that we have about what Canada is and what it can be. So we'll come back to that in a moment. But as we dive into this issue of the politics of remembrance, and I've just essentially been setting the stage here, we have this whole thing around Vimy Ridge as national mythology, this idea of Canada's coming of age. And we have two paintings here. And I think what we're doing here with these two paintings is we see Richard Jack's work on Vimy Ridge, which is on the right, and then Wyndham Lewis on the left, who also did this painting related to an artillery pit at Vimy. Two contrasting styles. And I think this always goes to show how, when we talk about storytelling, we talk about how people perceive Vimy Ridge. We always get different perceptions. And I want to start with just a few different ideas here. We're going to speak about the Vimy effect in two ways, and then the Vimy trap. So it was General Rick Hillier who first used the phrase Vimy effect, and he used it with regard to the military. And he was speaking about the idea of unified and visible leadership, valuing soldiers, and then operating as a learning organization. And he said that those were the key traits that led to the victory at Vimy, but not necessarily what it achieved. And those are his words. He then went on to, in a lot of presentations to, particularly in the business community, speak to this whole idea that when we talk about leadership, we can actually draw on this idea of the Vimy effect. We can learn from this idea of the importance of visible leadership, the importance of valuing staff, valuing people, and the idea of running your organization with a focus on learning and adaptation. And this was his book here that was published, I think, about 2010. Noah Riechler took a different tact. His book, What We Talk About When We Talk About War, basically looked at the question of Vimy, the Vimy effect, which was the name of one of the chapters. And he came down hard on the whole idea of the birth of the nation. When Canadians tell the story of the Battle of Vimy Ridge as a creation myth, they tell it in a manner that prompts complicity rather than outrage. And the outrage that he goes on to speak about is the over 3,500 Canadians that were killed over those days and the upwards of 10,000 that were wounded. And that's his perspective, and what we often say is a very polemic view, very rigid and absolute in how he perceived this idea of the Vimy effect. So quite in contrast to what Hillier was saying. So then we have Ian McKay and Jamie Swift and their piece, The Vimy Trap, which certainly offers a different perspective again. And so what is the Vimy Trap? And I've taken a few cuts or quotes from a lecture you can find on YouTube called The Vimy Trap, where Ian McKay walks through some of the key arguments. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but the trap is to imagine a modern war in general, and this battle in particular, as adventures in manliness and nation building. It is the trap of assenting to an official, feel-good, complicated nation-building experience, profoundly untruthful and childish story about the war. Vimyists tell us that all loyal Canadians, that they should pay homage to this battle in particular, and this war in general, as their collective birthday. And he goes on, as you can see here. So definitely we have criticism of the idea of Vimy and its position that it's taken over the years. And I'm not here to defend the nation building argument. I'm here to simply point out that when we get into remembrance and commemoration, it can be contested. It can be found as a political football at times. But let's go back to 2007. And again, we can look at some youth, and this was some work I did where we talked about the pre-trip experience, what they experienced in the moment, and then what they found significant about visiting Vimy Ridge for the 90th commemoration. And it's interesting to start with when I would ask, I was like, why is this important to do? And sometimes when you're a professor, you have to ask really stupid questions to get some really good answers. And I often found myself getting lectured in these responses by the students. So what we see here, I think, is the key elements of the Vimy myth. So in response to why is this important, they say, it is important today because Canada was born on April 9th. It was symbolic because it was the first time the whole Canadian Corps fought together. This meant that Canada as a nation could work together to achieve victory in the face of great adversity and previous failure by the British and French. So certainly back 14 years ago, this was kind of a common position that students were taking. Is it important to remember? Yes, because it was the first time Canada proved itself as independent to the Brits and the world. Go Canada. Of course, without remembering the reason why Canada was so important in one of her most uplifting moments of victory, then really, what is it to look back and say that Canada has been successful in any way? So you can see, certainly teachers have done their best to tell people about Vimy Ridge, and students have certainly glommed onto this idea of the birth of the nation. Those are the pre-trip survey. I wanted to gauge what the experience was when people went and then what they came back and what had changed for them. And here's just a few comments that people had. Every Canadian should visit. It brings an entirely different perspective to being Canadian. I've always wanted to see this memorial up close. It strikes me as something that all Canadians should do before they die. As Canadian, as driving across the country or visiting every province and territory or learning French. So there you go. Everybody needs to learn French. Each student represented a soldier that died at Vimy. There were a lot of students, meaning there were a lot of soldiers that died. Now, keep in mind, these are 15-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 16-year-olds that are speaking about this. And these opportunities where they're coming into contact, physical contact with these sites and the cemeteries and the memorials is having a deep effect on how they're perceiving their own history, not only from a national perspective, but I think also from a social perspective. There they are. This is the same. So same idea about, it was dreadful to think that this man died and that they did not know who he is. It made me realize how lucky I am to live a life that is not endangered by war. Simply to touch the monument was important for some people. Even just the presence of the monument and how the sun touched it was significant for some people. One of my most powerful memories about Vimy Ridge was being utterly shocked at how the earth had been destroyed by the battle. These things just simply cannot be conveyed by documentary or PowerPoint or a book. And often it's when you go to these sites that you have these powerful experiences. So concluding thoughts, this 3 ways to change the world was one of the activities that we did at the expo site. The whole item that I came up with earlier regarding Sir Walter Allward and his virtues of Canada, figures of truth, faith, justice, charity, knowledge, and peace, sing the hymn of peace. To me, I think this goes to a message far beyond discussing whether or not Canada was born here. it is a message that reminds us of what at that time an artist basically presented as these are virtues. He never said that they were virtues that we had at that time. I see them as virtues that we aspire to. We achieve them, and then sometimes we want to go higher in our knowledge, in our belief in justice, in our belief in charity. These are important things that I think we go overseas to learn. I've mentioned this idea of remembering well. It's about, for me, it's about being aware of our own connections to war history, maybe learning our own family history, or what happened to our community, maybe local regiments, building our imagination, memory, and emotion in teaching and learning. The way we create connection with these stories and engagement is by coming up with strong ways to link learners with these things that happened over 100 years ago. Hence the importance of Valour Canada's work. Supporting trips overseas to sites of war memory. I've already mentioned several times the resonant and powerful element that has on people, not only youth, but I'm sure many of us here would agree. Taking remembrance into an action that contributes to today's world. We start by remembering what happened in the past. We take what we learned from that event and we think about its relevance to the world we're in today. And I think that's the power of making things relevant in today's world. Politics of memory, politics of remembrance are always going to be there. And I think that that's something that we'll just have to get used to when we go through these different iterations of books such as Richelieu and Mackay. I don't think we should ignore them. I think we should read them and try to understand where they're coming from, and then to rethink how we're looking at our history, and then make our rebuttal. So here's my concluding thoughts. We are all part of the evolution in how we remember Vimy and the Great War. Remembrance evolves from decade to decade. I mentioned 1990, 2007 to 2017. You saw the effort that went into the 2017 event was far greater than the 2007 event, and we could expect that for the 100th anniversary. But let's look ahead. What are we going to do at the 110th and beyond? Vimy stands as an entry point into war heritage and history, not as a conclusion. And I think this is the importance that we have to place on Vimy Ridge. It's an incredible story, and yet we need to use this as the catch to take us into areas to the east, to the north, and to the west that are relevant to the story of Canada in the First World War, as well as the Second World War and beyond. Korean War, Afghanistan. Allward's virtues are what we can aspire to uphold as individuals and as a nation. We can practice ways to remember well. Finally, to support the good efforts of Valour Canada. On that note, I'll say thank you very much, and in remembrance. Thank you.
Thanks, Geoff. That was fantastic. And thank you for the support to Valour Canada. And I don't want to, I will just add that the Royal Alberta United Service Institute does some great work in remembrance as well. And they're a co-sponsor. So I'm going to let you catch your breath and maybe get a glass of water as we jump into some of the questions here. So we've got a bunch of questions that come in, but please, if you've got additional ones, post them in the chat. But I'm going to put Dr. Brennan on the spot to start. And the first question we have here is, other than the scale, how does the success at Vimy Ridge compare to that of Hill 70? Dr. Brennan, over to you.
Well, actually, there isn't, I mean, it is a smaller scale, Hill 70. Hill 70 is sort of two battles. I mean, there's a great debate in the historical community between those who believe it's sort of two battles, and that Lons was really separate and in many ways a failure. Hill 70, of course, was a brilliant successor, whether it's just one battle and so on, but it was on a slightly lesser scale. But I would argue there isn't, apart from that distinction, okay, if one subscribed to it, I happen to, I know my friend Tim Cook does not, and so on, but anyway, that there isn't a lot of difference between the two. The types of things that were done, the doctrine that was applied, and so on and so forth was pretty similar. The big difference, of course, I suppose, is Currie as commander for the first time. A Canadian commands the Canadian Corps, and one might have expected a few bumps in his first battle as Corps commander. But anyway, no, I think they're comparable. And of course, one of the tragedies only recently remedied by volunteers in the private sector, in effect, is that there was no memorial for Hill 70 Lons until just a couple of years ago, and how it was left out of the list to be commemorated is kind of amazing. And that is, or it's not amazing, it's hard to comprehend. And that's in a sense evidence to show, at least in my opinion, that there was very little to choose between the two battles in sort of what they told us about Canadian arms and Canadian fighting ability and so on and so forth.
Perfect, thank you very much. All right, Geoff, I'm going to jump back to you. We're going to probably just go back and forth if that works for everybody. So how does Canada deliver education and remembrance without crossing the line of glorifying war, which is often distasteful to many Canadians?
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point, and certainly a focus for the Vimy Trap book, and I think for Tim Cook's book as well, and other scholars who are looking at this, as well as managers of sites. There's no easy answer to that. I think the thing is there has to be a deep respect for those who lost their lives. I think it's about watching the jingoism. As much as we as Canadians want to focus on our Canadian story, I think if we are able to also understand the broader narrative and to understand the experience of other countries, it gives us a greater perspective on the sacrifices made by others and the tremendous loss of life in the First World War. And I think it begins to put things into perspective that many nations had their sense of birth, such as Australia, but also many nations lost the cream of their youth at that time. So I think understanding the history, understanding the strategies and tactics is important, and also understanding the toll beyond the actual war is important.
Excellent, thank you. And maybe what we'll do is we'll do two and then bounce back to Dr. Brennan for two, so I don't have Toki having to play to jump back and forth between you. So the second question for Geoff, how do you see the idea of visiting overseas memorial sites evolving to a post-pandemic world?
So I do a lot of work, as you can see, on the tourism side. I think we're basically seeing a lot of people itching to go travel again. I'm sure a lot of you feel the same way about going back and visiting some of these places. I think that the larger issue will be how we maybe try to expand beyond places such as Vimy Ridge, and try to expand our knowledge and our learning by going to other places. So I think the whole thing around tourism and working with those battlefield guides that are knowledgeable and that can provide experiences that allow us to link into these other stories. And I'm sure we're mostly interested in our Canadian stories, and there are many of them there. Even the idea of, are there projects out there such as building trails, a trail system where we could actually, and I find the 100 Days area quite a fascinating area because it's so open and relatively remote. There's not a lot of villages in the area, and lots of farmers' fields. And what an opportunity to have some kind of trail system that would allow people to walk that trail and to learn another part of the Great War history. So I think it's about figuring out new ways to look at how we remember, and then also have activities that allow us to reflect on how we take those ideas and use them in the present day.
Thanks, Geoff. Interestingly, one of the projects Valour Canada's initial stages of working on, it's not Vimy related, but it's a walking trail through Sicily and the Operation Husky area. So that's connecting the geography and the stories is interesting. Okay, I'm going to jump back to Dr. Brennan. Could you speak to some of the logistical challenges that the Germans faced in defending Vimy? I know you mentioned in your talk, geography was a big piece of that, but perhaps you could expand a little bit on it.
The biggest single problem I had was not being able, as I said, to implement defense in depth properly, because there was a substantial gap in between their defense, the existing defensive perimeter, right, sort of a line at the top of the ridge, which was measured in hundreds of meters deep. And when they could sort of resume it again, because they couldn't resume it simply in flat country at the bottom of the ridge, because on the assumption that we got to the top, or at least some of us got to the top, then there would be artillery spotting and so on. So they had to, the very height of the ridge, the steepness of some of the terrain precludes them doing what they would like to have done, and then the very height, on the assumption that the attackers will capture it. And the impact that it has on artillery spotting, accurate artillery spotting, means they have to pull back a long ways. Certainly, the logistical problems they faced, I think that sort of explains the problem of having the reserves so far back. But, and a thin crust, basically, which of course we broke through, and then that was that. The situation after we'd broken through, well, any German forces coming up, and they had substantial, not as much as they should have had. We outnumbered them about 4-1, but they had substantial forces that could have been brought forward. But they simply too much artillery observation going on, and they would have been massacred. Which is, they were smart enough to pull back and hunker down more or less out of the range of our artillery spotting and our artillery, and reconstitute their line. And in fact, when you stand up on Vimy Ridge, it was a good view of it. In one of Geoff's pictures of the grieving mother, in the distance, about 7 kilometers away, you see the coal slag heaps of Lens. And we got there in August, but middle of August 1918. So April, May, June, July, 4 months it took us to cover that distance, because the Germans had pulled back because they realized that logistically and otherwise there was no point in trying to occupy that area. They in fact withdrew completely.
Perfect. And this question might be a bit of a broad one, but I'll let you tackle the specific part. But I know you're writing the history of the King's Own Cavalry Regiment, and they perpetuate the 50th Battalion from the First World War. Do you have any maybe anecdotes from the 50th? I know they took the ground where the memorial sits today that you'd like to share with the group.
Yeah, one of the points, bear with me here. I'm getting to the point. One of the things that students often came up with when I would talk to them about bite and hold attacks and how it was, designed to be much more efficient and so on and so forth and effective, is they would point to the casualty list, the butcher's bill at Vimy, which is pretty grim. Canada has almost 4.5 times as many people today. So you just multiply all those figures by 4.5, and you think of that happening 96 hours. Okay, and it's horrific. Okay, the casualty list. And in the case of the 50th Battalion, they were part of the 4th Division, which only went into action, last division to form, and only went into action toward the tail end of the Somme. So for about half of their soldiers, the 50th Battalion was their first battle. They had a brand new commanding officer, just appointed less than a month before the attack. The so-called quiet times, it wasn't very quiet before. There was a lot of raiding going on and so on, a lot of casualties. But the point is that there was a lot of, they use a terrible term, wastage, et cetera, but anyway, there was a lot of them in their first battle. They lose half their men, half the men committed. By the time they take the Pimple on the 12th, they have lost half their soldiers, killed or wounded. Many of them, of course, will come back, but an awful lot of them, the wounded I'm talking about, will not come back. And at the time, there was very little talk among the ordinary soldiers. They were conscious that they had used new techniques, empowered platoons and all of this sort of stuff. And they were generally favorably exposed towards the destruction wrought by the preliminary bombardment and by the effectiveness most of the times when they attacked of the creeping barrages or the rolling barrages. But there was very little, changed for them. And there was very little sense that they were proud of the achievement, but there was very little sense they tried anything new and that people like me would be rabbiting on years later about how this was the most important thing determined at Vimy was not birth of a nation, but the verification of this template for attack, which the VEF and certainly the Canadian Corps used religiously right to the end of the war with some considerable success. There are a lot of individual stories of again what we read about in books about as officers are killed, as senior NCOs are killed, ordinary soldiers have to rise up and under the most horrific conditions and lead men, and battles are won and lost by small groups of infantry and by individuals who rise to the occasion, and it's impossible to predict who is going to be brave and so on and so forth. It's an awful lot of stories like that I've come across. And then the tremendous sense of grief. Certainly in the aftermath of the battle, as I said, there was, I think the 50s was typical in that the survivors were extraordinarily proud of what had been achieved. On the other hand, people were just numb by the losses. They were given time off, except they had to go help bury the dead, which in the case of the Germans, they weren't buried. They were piled in huge funeral pyres burning on the bridge and giving off this nauseating smoke from burning flesh and so on. Rather like it was a bunch of Hindu soldiers who were being buried, but there's only way to get rid of them quick enough. And stuff like that. It just, there was none, maybe the glory sank in later, but, and what had been achieved, but other than a feeling that something great had been achieved and they've been part of it, the effect of combat, one is left in awe of what these men went through. Really, I really am. That doesn't quite answer the question, but it's best I can do.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Brennan. And I'll give you a break for a second. And Geoff, I got a question for you, and I think you and I have spoken about this in the past. But for any of those who might have followed it, the 200th anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo was a couple of years ago, and we saw great reenactments on the battlefield, horses and soldiers marching around and shooting blank rounds at one another. So if you were predicting, what would the 200th anniversary of Vimy Ridge look like for Canadians?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The whole thing of, well, let's just speak to reenactment for a moment, because our American friends with the American Civil War have often focused on reenactments, and that has declined over time as younger generations just haven't picked up on it. And so there's one thing with this whole idea of reenactment. However, when you go to Normandy, they have another issue where they have a lot of people showing up in uniforms and of varying degrees of accuracy, shall we say. And some of them are dressing in German uniforms. And in France, they've actually created a rule or laws that prevent people from wearing, in the case of Second World War, German uniforms. If they're outside like a specific area, like if it's a demonstration area, they can wear them in there, but they can't walk down the streets of St. Mary Glees wearing an SS uniform. So they've really clamped down on controlling that. The First World War, I think, has a different feel to it, obviously, but some of the same issues may still apply as about glorification. I guess this goes to your earlier question, is what is seen as remembering well and what is seen as a little bit over the top. And it's interesting when, we don't have time to really talk about a place like Gallipoli, but the range of politics of remembrance, when you look at a place like Gallipoli, is just, it's probably bigger than Vimy, not just for the Australians, but for the Turks, and how they've replayed that. So I think because of the level of sensitivity there is around a place like Vimy Ridge, I think having any kind of reenactment, or what people might say is war play, would be the criticism leveled, might not happen there. I'm sure that it might occur in some field in British Columbia, or somewhere else in this country where some kind of activity may occur. But in the sense of on the actual ground, I think we often view sites of war memory as sacred, hallowed ground. So I would see some kind of event that was similar to what we saw with the 100th, probably, because of the reputation that and mythology that we have around Vimy Ridge, it could be as significant, if not larger. The years ahead will tell. Vimy is that one event. We don't rally as much around, say, St. Julian or Mount Sorel or the last 100 days like we do Vimy. Vimy becomes that gateway into the First World War for many Canadians. And so, it will stand as that, the significance of the monument, all those things will just maintain it as a marker in Canadian heritage for a long, long time. I don't think we'll see anything. We won't see it coming down. We'll see those cemeteries there in 100 years. So I think that's what I would say.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Geoff. All right, that actually concludes the majority of the questions. I'd like to take the opportunity for anyone else who's still in the line, if they'd like to raise their hand, we can unmute you to ask a question. Maybe we'll just pause for a moment or two to see if anyone does that. I'm going to have to see if I can figure out Zoom to make sure I can see that. Okay, we actually have one extra question, and I guess this would, I'd say is for Geoff. So you mentioned that in the 1920s, St. Julian and the Second Battle of Ypres was more important. Why do you think the emphasis shifted over the years from that?
Maybe Pat can help me with that one too. Well, I think I've heard Tim Cook speak on this a few times. I've read the book, and it just seems like there was this nuance. It wasn't like some sudden a moment. It was a gentle shift that started to pay greater attention to Vimy Ridge. I think a particular quote where someone started talking about it in the 60s is a birth of a nation. And I think over time there was a momentum. And Tim Cook actually says, as his last line in his book, which I always thought was very poignant. Just give me a second here. He always says that something to the effect of, the memorial is for the dead. Canada was indeed forever changed by the Great War, but Vimy did not make the nation. It was the nation that made Vimy. And the shift towards looking at Vimy Ridge as the birth of the nation, I think, is always validated by things like the 4 divisions were together. It was the first time for a lot of things for the Canadian Corps coming together. So in that way, there was lots of reason and rationale to say, if we're going to say anywhere is going to be the birth of the nation, it would be this one, because you had battalions from across the country that were represented and all 4 divisions. Well, then the debate begins, right? As to other battles previous. So often the view of the Second Battle of Ypres was, of course, it was our baptism of fire. So where do you place the birth of the nation if you're going to use that term? Where does the debate pivot? So I don't know, Pat, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, yeah, thanks for, I do have a few thoughts. Professors always have thoughts. The switch, when you think about it, occurs very early, because the decision is made in the early 20s that Vimy is going to be the memorial. Mm-hmm. And I think, the reasons then, well, to put it this way, I think Ypres suffered from firstitis, for lack of a better way of putting it. Like, it was the first battle, so it was the first one, but it couldn't stand up against the kind of all the arguments, and you've outlined them, I think, very well, Geoff. The fact that the whole army was there, so there was so many veterans that had vested interest in Vimy, for example, than their next of kin that had it in Second Ypres. So I think that early on, and this, it just does more. And we wouldn't be having this argument now, if you know what I mean. Like we would say, well, Second Ypres was the first. That's all it's got going for it, basically. You know, it's a defensive battle, you know, and so on and so forth. And it doesn't even represent the nation at arms in the same way, in the sense that the first division in its initial incarnation was full of people who were veterans of the British Army and full of British immigrants, but mostly picked not because they were British so much, just because they had military experience in Britain and so on. And they were, I think, in the aftermath of the war, when this Canadianism, I mean, honest to God, legitimate, you know, beginnings of Canadian nationalism had taken root, that recommended Vimy as well. You know, that was the army of those who, you know, it was more Canadian. I mean, the army was never more than about 50% Canadian born, but so that, and the fact that it was on a much bigger scale, and it won, I think, for reasons which are justifiable, and that decision was made, you know, early on, really. And Second Ypres lost for reasons which are kind of readily identifiable, and no reflection on the importance of Second Ypres. But it just seems like, as I say, looking back at it now, you know, what else would you have, which other battle would you have taken, you know?
Yeah. And it's interesting when we talk about how we, the significance of the memorial, because it was often and early on identified that the Allward design warranted a hillside. You know, you know, there was thoughts around, well, if you were to put it in the flat landscape of Ypres, aside from Mount Sorel, which is relatively small given the size of the ridge, would it have that same power? And as many of us who've been there, when you go out into the Douai Plain and you look, you know, south towards the memorial, it just really stands out. It just really makes a mark throughout the area. Local soccer teams will have the Vimy Memorial on their badge, and it's iconic in the area. And I think that really lends itself to something that is memorable. As much as I love the Clemshaw Memorial in St. Julian, you know, it's hidden. It's hard to situate yourself as to where you are in the battlefield, and you really have to know how to read a map to understand the lay of the land for the Second Battle of Ypres. Whereas Vimy, it's pretty evident, right, when you're standing there. So I think that has all these benefits, as Pat said, to in the early days, to establish the growing significance of Vimy.
Excellent. Thank you very much, both. We do have another question here. And I think I could open up to both. So maybe I'll ask Dr. Brennan to answer first and Dr. Bird second. What was the role of heritage and cultural backgrounds of the Canadian soldiers during Vimy and the CF? So in particular, Indigenous soldiers and their contributions, how prevalent was the multicultural? I know from my personal experience, the 10th Battalion speaks often of the Japanese Canadians who fought there with that battalion. And obviously there's Indigenous soldiers there as well. So perhaps Dr. Brennan, if you could maybe remark on that.
Yeah, well, firstly, the whole army really represented Anglo-Canada. I mean, there were a lot of what we now call minorities, including ethnic Ukrainians and so on and so forth in the army. But most of these groups were discouraged quite strongly during the war. They filtered into the army, sometimes to prove their loyalty and so on, sometimes to better their situation, sometimes because their friends were doing it. I mean, but when it came to visible minorities, you know, that it was a racist society. It was, and racist war effort. Now that said, Native Canadians were, you know, originally discouraged and encouraged as we needed more men, and they served with distinction in the army. There was no particular racism in the army. They served in combat units, and they mixed in first Native person, most of the comrades, white comrades I'd ever seen, and they fit in well, and they were not discriminated against until after the war. Then they were discriminated against plenty, but we know the story of Oriental Canadians. Japan was our ally, and they were seen as militaristic people. They would have been naturals, you would have thought, but they were strongly rejected in British Columbia, where most of them lived, and they were absorbed in some Alberta units, for example, for a time, because Again, battalions were short of men when they were being raised here, and they took whatever they could get. The problem with a lot of the Japanese, and they were in the 50th Battalion too, was that they couldn't speak English, most of them. So it was a real problem. Any Japanese who could volunteer who could speak English had to become an NCO. And none of the officers were all white Euro Canadians. They couldn't speak Japanese. And so there was this terrible problem with replacing their NCOs and reinforcements in general. And eventually they were all turned into cooks and batmen, which is, they fought very well for the time they fought and so on. But the problem with blacks, I think, is well understood now, more racism than anything. Generally speaking, the Japanese, though, and Native Canadians are the best example because they're the biggest group, frankly. I'm sure they are visible minorities. They serve within white units and serve well and are treated well. As I say, the problems became before the war, of course, in terms of discrimination, and after the war discrimination. But it was a positive experience in that sense, had a huge impact on the Native leadership of Native rights movement in the 1920s and 30s. A great many of them were war veterans. They had learned both pan-Indianness, for lack of a better term, that is to say, tribes and all of this stuff the whites used to characterize them. Didn't matter if you were Aboriginal Canadian in one province, you were treated just as badly as you were in another province. In other words, that's how they had to look at themselves, and that they were the equal of the white man. And they weren't allowed to be the equal of the white man after the war, but it had a profound effect on Native soldiers, and they were respected. I know one of the great snipers of the First World War was in the 50th Battalion of the whole British Empire Forces, Henry Norwest, who was Métis, but he was widely respected by his white colleagues, who I'm sure, as a soldier and as a man, because he was a soldier, such a good soldier, he would not have been respected in 1913 by those same people. So there are positives about the experience, and they certainly were integrated. There was no effort to have an all Indian and all Native Aboriginal unit. If no other reason, it couldn't be reinforced, probably. Whereas New Zealand had Maori units in combat. So it was in that sense, it was a multicultural, multi-ethnic effort in the army. It's just that a lot of the acceptance of people was driven by the need for reinforcements, and it didn't have much of an impact after the war. Several Japanese Canadians who served in Alberta units at the front in the First World War won the Military Cross were interned in 1942. So anyway, I had to.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brennan. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I often imagine what the range of accents would have been like in a given battalion, and how rich it would have been to just listen. Everything across the British Isles, people that maybe had settled in Canada for a few generations, plus people from Europe, the odd maybe Dutch or Scandinavian that's there. And just that sense of identity formation that was occurring through a uniform and the wearing of a maple leaf by all these people. And you do find it when you search the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. And a lot of the single guys, they would have their next of kin as their parents back in Scotland or that kind of thing. So definitely, when you dig into the Library and Archives Canada records, you can see people that have been in Canada for, say, 3, 4, 5 years, and then they're going overseas with the Canadians to fight. So in terms of one of the documentaries we did was with the Métis on their new war memorial in Batoche, and the title of it is called The Great Equalizer. And when we talked to the gang at Gabriel Dumont, who was doing some fantastic research on and the gang, I mean other scholars, Métis scholars, looking at who had fought in different wars, because of course, as Métis, they couldn't say they were Indian or they weren't white, so they would basically have to choose which one they would tick the box for. So that would often lead them to get lost. So the Batoche effort and the war memorial there was essentially to focus on trying to go by names and family stories to identify all the Métis that had fought in the war. And the great equalizer is, as Pat says, by uniform, they were equal. After the war, they didn't necessarily get the same benefits, nor did they get access to, say, the Legion. Those kinds of things really showed the racism back in Civvy Street was quite distinct, and certainly sad. So when I look at the virtues of the Allward Memorial, we also have to think of the context of the 20s, where we did have residential schools, we did have racism, we had a bunch of issues going on. So I often see them as virtues to which we aspire to, and that we have to think about a lot. And I think we do well at them in many cases.
Yeah, I
Thanks,
think
Geoff. There's a
I was going to say part of the problem today is among those who believe that perfection has to be achieved immediately in these issues. I don't think do give a fair voice to the achievements that that were made at the time, and the changes that occurred, subtle and not as quick as we would have liked, and so on and so forth. You also, just one last quick point about the Vimy Memorial, the unknowns. One of the things you can see, there's many interesting things you can see about from the names, but one is you'll see a name like John Anderson, and then in brackets it'll say Swiderski, where he lied about his name to enlist because he was from a less desirable group, and there was plenty of that went on, which tells you all sorts of things, some good and some not so good, but some good too, that he wanted to serve and he was being Canadianized, if you like, by the process, and presumably his comrades, who would have known perfectly well from his accent that he wasn't Anderson, learned something about the so-called new Canadians, as they were called politely at the time.
Excellent. We have a follow-up to that question, which I think will be our final question for the evening. And I'm not sure we have expertise for this, but we'll ask the question and see what everybody knows. Why was the Canadian approach different than the New Zealand approach? For example, the All Maori Battalion and a similar All Indigenous Battalion here in Canada.
Well, firstly, my understanding, as I just reviewed a book that deals with these issues, is that the Maoris were behind getting the All Maori Battalion. They were going to be used as labor troops. For example, what we used the famous 2nd Construction Battalion of African Canadian troops for, which was a dismissive kind of role and spoke of not acknowledging their manliness and so on and so forth. And it was the Maoris that wanted that, and they received that, and there was enough of them in the population, enough apparently willing to serve, largely for gaining rights for the Maori themselves post-war or during the war and post-war, that they could reinforce it. Okay, and Maoris also served in white units. There was never that kind of organized sense of unity among Aboriginal Canadians. That's the thing, and the war helps to create some of that among those who serve, that they have more in common, Cree with Iroquois and so on, than they ever dreamed. I mean, they're all, as far as the whites are concerned, they're just Indians, and so pan-Indianness has to be, as it was called in the 20s by native groups, has to be developed. So it was that different situation. They didn't see themselves as one entity to even ask for that kind of right. Whether it would have been granted is another matter.
Thank you, Geoff. Do you have anything to add there?
Just one small point. Just as it's interesting if you read "Death So Noble" by Jonathan Vance, and he speaks about Joseph Brant, who was a descendant of a great chief. He was with the 4th Battalion. He died on the 22nd or 23rd of April, 1915. And he was a very important figure to talk about in Max Aitken's book, In Flanders Fields, because there was a real effort to try to build out war art, which is, of course, another project of Aitken, where he was trying to memorialize Canada's efforts. And he wanted to be able to link it backwards into earlier times of the settlement of Canada and the involvement of Indigenous people in wars. And so Joseph Brant was that link. And so often there's a very complex relationship, I think, between Indigenous involvement in the Canadian Army and memorialization. And so it is really quite a big story. And there's, I'm thinking about the book, was it For King in Canada, which was done by Tim Weingard, which might be of interest to some people. And there may be some other books out there. I think it's an area that really could do with some more research. Yeah.
Agreed.
Excellent. Well, I think that's the last question I have on my list. And we've been at this now for 2.5 hours. So I think we're going to bring this to a conclusion. So I'd like to thank and ask everybody to virtual round of applause for Dr. Brennan, Dr. Bird, and Dr. Jones, who was obviously just not involved in the question and answer, for, I believe, bringing some very new insights into the Battle of Vimy Ridge. We learned about the grand strategic piece of it and how really the Battle of Arras was a bit of a diversion. We learned some of the misconceptions from Dr. Brennan around the fighting and not being an all-Canadian effort. And then in particular, Dr. Bird on some very insightful looks at Remembrance and how that's evolved over time. So thank you very, very much for taking part in the evening. And I guess a round of applause. I know everyone's muted, so I apologize for that, but thank you. And for the participants, thank you very much for joining us this evening. I believe we'll be sending out a quick survey to everybody afterwards, just to see how everybody felt about the event and possible future events. So please watch for that in your inbox. And again, thank you everybody for attending this evening. I'll stay on the line for a few moments if there's any questions or anything. But other than that, have a great evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks, Paul, and to Peter, too. Nice to meet you, Pat.
Yes, nice to meet you too, Geoff. And thanks to all the support staff. God knows I needed it.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I
Yeah,
probably,
thanks to
and
the
I
support
apologize.
staff, yeah.
I should have thanked Jordan and Toki and Rachel and all the behind the scenes people from both RAUSI and Valour Canada for making sure everything worked. My apologies, I was remiss in that piece. So thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.